Hey guys, super excited to bring to you a tutorial today about the gem VCR. Now, VCR is a really amazing gem that makes testing a little bit easier to deal with. What it does is it will record the response from an HTTP request and put that in what's called a cassette or a YAML file, and at whatever directory you'd like. That way, every subsequent test that you run, instead of actually making the call to the API or making the HTTP request, it will reference that YAML file. And that's really useful for two reasons. The first one, your test will just run faster after the initial test that records on the cassette. And the second thing that it does is it keeps your actual API requests down. So if you needed to test, if you knew you weren't going to have internet, but you needed to get some work done or something, you could install VCR, run some initial tests to get the response you needed, and then go off without internet, go into the middle of nowhere, and you can still test your application, test your HTTP request to ensure that it's calling correctly and getting the response that you need. And so that's the great thing that it does. Also, if you have limits on how many times you can call an API, this is great for managing that as well, which there's stuff like Twitter and Google Maps and some of Amazon stuff. They all have limits on how much you can call their API. So managing that is great when you're just testing and having to run tests over and over and over again. So here's the main documentation. A couple steps that it gives us is to, of course, install the gem, to configure it, and then just some useful information about some more configuration stuff and some running some tests and things like that. So definitely you want to come in here and overview this if you want to get deeper into it. But just for the sake of brevity, let's get into what we're doing today. Cool. So here is our project. It's a simple gem that makes a request to a very simple API. This is not a complex thing that we're working on. This is just a project that I did that I kind of cleaned up a little bit for the purposes of this tutorial. So this is our gem spec file. And the first thing that we need to do to get rolling on this is install VCR, HTTParty, and WebMock. Now, HTTParty is the library that's going to actually allow us to make the calls very simply in our code and very cleanly. And WebMock is going to stub those HTTP requests. VCR needs something like WebMock or FakeWeb in order to work properly. So you can't just use HTTParty or another net HTTP library. You need to use WebMock or FakeWeb and then whatever library you want underneath. So for this tutorial, of course, we're using WebMock. So once you have those dependencies added to your gem file or added to your gem spec, if it's a gem, go ahead and run bundle to make sure that it's installed properly, bundle install. And then we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to do today. So let's check out our spec first. So this is the spec that we're going to implement VCR on. So it's just a simple initialization method that gets an authorization token from the server after you pass in an email and password, and it will store that in an instance variable. That way you can use it throughout the rest of your methods. And so it's very simple. It's not complicated. I wanted it to be simple enough that we could just get through it pretty fast. So this is the spec. It just makes sure that that's a string. That's it. That the auth token is a string, that is. And so pretty simple. And then we can go into our main file here, and we can see that I've already written the initialization method, and it does what it needs to do. And just as it is now, if I run the test, it will go ahead and call the API that I'm using, and the test pass. Everything's functioning the way it does. It needs to. Say I'm going to be out on a plane, don't have Wi-Fi because plane Wi-Fi can be really expensive, or say I'm going to be out in the middle of nowhere, I don't have internet or something. VCR is going to be great to implement with this, so I can see how it's calling the API, and so I can record it and manage it offline and things. So the first thing we need to do is configure VCR, and the easiest thing to do for the purposes of this tutorial, we're going to place it in the spec helper file. If you have a more robust application you're developing, or a bigger Rails application, or better gem or whatever, you're definitely going to want to place this in a VCR_config file instead of the spec helper like I'm going to do. It's just so simple for this tutorial just to place it in the spec helper file and not have to worry about calling any other files or requiring it or whatever. It's already requiring the spec helper where I need it. So we're just going to go ahead and add it in there. So let's set up our configuration. We're going to do VCR.configure do. Here's our block, and then we'll just set that to C. So we'll do C.cassette underscore library underscore directory equals spec/VCR. Now this is going to be the directory that our tapes, that our cassettes get recorded to. Our YAML files go in there. So we set that first, and then we set the stubber that is going to be used, which for us it will be webmock. So since we have the configure file set up, the next thing that we need to do is set up VCR to record a cassette on a specific spec. But before we do that, let's run the test and let's see what happens. So you see the test fails, uninitialized constant VCR. So this is simple. This is fixable. I didn't require it, so let's require it. And let's run the test again. So here we go. We can see now that it is failing. Our spec is failing, and this is why. This is the error that we're getting. VCR errors, unhandled HTTP request error. So it says an HTTP request has been made that VCR does not know how to handle. So VCR will actually block all of your HTTP requests unless you pass it through VCR. And this is a good and a bad thing depending on your use case. Of course, there's a configuration option that you can use to set it a different way. So if you wanted to allow all API calls through or something, you can configure that inside of this configure block. But for the purposes of this tutorial, we're just going to kind of move on. So we can see that it's failing. So we need to go into our actual spec and we need to add a place for it to record the cassette. We need to add like what it's going to record into a cassette and what the name of that cassette is going to be. So here is our main block. We're going to go ahead and add the stuff that we need to just right here, right above our logic. And what we're going to add here is VCR.use_cassette, and then we're going to name it initialize do, and then here's our logic, and then end. Perfect, and that's it. So now if we run our spec, it's going to pass. And what's even cooler is if we go in here to our VCR, our spec/VCR folder, which we specified here in our spec helper VCR configure block, we can see that we have an initialize.yaml file that holds the response from the server. So now every subsequent test that I run, it's going to reference that initialize.yaml file, which is awesome. It's going to utilize this cassette. So that's it for today. It's just a very basic overview of what VCR does and how great it is and how useful it can be. I hope you guys got a lot out of this tutorial. I look forward to making more in the future, and I hope you guys all have a good one.